We'll kick off with the first panel on creating conditions for innovation in R&D, and that'll be moderated by Beverly Taylor. She's the head of Influenza Scientific Affairs at Seqirus, and she's been had a leadership role in the IFPMA Influenza Vaccine Supply Task Force for the last 10 years. Her full bios with the conference materials, with the workshop materials, and I'm going to hand over to Beverly now, and thanks very much.
Thanks, Heidi. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are. It's my absolute pleasure to be the moderator for the first panel today, which will discuss creating conditions for innovation in research and development. This is a really important topic and one which has proved critical in the response to COVID-19. We have an excellent panel for this discussion. I'm really looking forward to it, and I'll introduce you to them now. I'll start off with Carolyn Finkle, who is the Chief Operating Officer at Medicago, who are pioneering novel plant-based transient expression and manufacturing. Then we have Charu Kaushic, Chair of Global Research Collaboration for Infectious Disease Preparedness and Scientific Director of the Canadian Institutes of Health Research. And we have finally Maria Elena Bottazzi, who is Associate Dean in the National School of Tropical Medicine, Baylor College of Medicine, and a leading expert in vaccine development. So welcome to our panel members. I'm going to kick off by asking an introductory question to get us going. If you could explain how you are involved in research and development and what you see as some of the promising technologies for the future. I'll start off with Carolyn for this one.
Thank you very much, Beverly, and hello, everybody. It's our pleasure to be in this very exciting panel today with my esteemed colleagues to discuss R&D and pandemic preparedness. So first of all, as Beverly mentioned, we have a novel platform manufacturing system at Medicago. It's a plant-based system using plant as host for recombinant protein expression. We would be basically an alternate. We're doing a COVID vaccine as well. We're in our phase 3 trials right now and would be an alternate to the mRNA and adenoviral vector approaches for COVID vaccination. For the future, it's important, I think, to have platforms, manufacturing platforms for production of vaccines. And it's important to have multiple tools, if you will, in our armament as we fight these pandemics, to have the ability quickly to express, to basically get the sequence and express, in our case, the protein, and get the production moving as quickly as possible to get into clinical development. And that is something that we've been working on with the COVID vaccine. Of course, producing through a biological process is different. Which has its own scale up and matters that need to be dealt with. But it's very important that we engage with private-public funding and as a small biotech to be able to contribute and partner potentially with larger pharma to contribute to the overall fight for pandemic preparedness. And certainly we've seen through NIH and BARDA, as well as the DoD, there's been funding that's been made available to manufacturers, small manufacturers and large, to invest in the capability for manufacturing, both upstream and downstream, to provide sufficient domestic and global manufacturing capability. I think the other element as far as enabling technologies is in addition to good and broad private, public-private funding, is to have the funding, for example, with the mRNA that was in place that enabled them to work on SARS-1 and MERS, for example, that enabled them to do some of the preclinical work and early development of their manufacturing to get up and running quite quickly. And that certainly paid off when we came to SARS-CoV-2 for the mRNA technology to really get up and running, and provided a vaccine as early as November, December 2020. Also, we saw that the regulatory agencies were able to rapidly issue guidance to industries so that industries were following the same rules, essentially, of what would be required for evidentiary data to provide a risk-benefit assessment for the vaccine. And we really applaud the fact that not only FDA, but other ICH members came quite quickly to the table with guidance to enable manufacturers to understand what would be required for submission. And also providing early access through various mechanisms so that vaccines, once demonstrated in terms of its risk benefit to provide a potential solution to protection against SARS-CoV-2, enabled for those vaccines to get out into distribution even ahead of full licensure. As we look forward, I think, to variants, we have also developed a variant program in development, as have other manufacturers, because we do need to be prepared in case there is a potential strain change that's going to be required for the vaccine. And again, we look to applaud, I think, the regulatory authorities that have been able to put, again, updates to their guidance that would enable companies to understand what would be required for a strain change, what clinical evidence would be required to accept that for changing the vaccine. I think that's been very, very helpful. When we look at, I think, some of the questions regarding the futuristic products, if you will, what would be the required investment? I think what we've seen quite key is that there is, enhanced, I think, public funding for infectious disease and virology research. I think there's been over the last several years cut in a lot of funding, which has not enabled some of the research, academic research, to keep up in these important fields. And I think we saw through this pandemic that a lot of the information that's going to eventually be translated into a product starts with that academic research. And I think enhancing public funding for research is going to be key. Again, further public-private funding for biotech companies, because biotech companies are typically where that innovation first translates and gets moving into the development, and then partnering with potentially larger pharma companies to bring it to a global market. We do think also that pharma companies, which have, over again the last several years, divested from some of these areas, perhaps should reconsider and enhance partnerships with biotechs to drive the development because they do have the established global footprint, and that might be something that can assist in looking at futuristic products. And then in terms of the regulatory responses, I sort of touched on that earlier, but one of the other aspects is surrogate measurements, and certainly the government has been looking at this. There isn't any established correlate right now for the SARS-CoV-2 or for COVID-19. However, there is correlates that have been demonstrated in influenza, for example, with the hemagglutinin antibody titer, and we are hoping that regulatory bodies can maybe act quickly in this regard to adopt, and in its regulatory framework, recognize correlate for vaccine efficacy, which would again enhance development of vaccines. And also, I think when we look at the influenza frame, the government has been slow to accept other surrogates that might be useful as predictors of vaccine efficacy, such as cell-mediated responses. And that might be a role also to do more work with the regulatory bodies to, from an industry perspective, to coordinate perhaps and provide the evidentiary database and information that would enable the government to adopt some of these additional correlates, which may be important again for rapid vaccine development.
Thank you.
And then finally,
oh, sorry.
Okay, thank you, Beverly. Excuse me.
I just want to give Charu and Maria an opportunity.
Thank you.
Charu, would you like to go next?
Yeah, so thanks very much, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world joining us today. And thanks very much to the organizers for inviting me to participate in this really important discussion. So I'll start with some overarching remarks. In my position as the scientific director of a Canadian Institutes of Health Research Institute of Infection and Immunity, I'm also chairing the global consortium of research funders that are invested in the area of pandemic preparedness and response, the GLOPADAR. There are 29 funders that are part of this organization, and they range from funders such as foundations like Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Wellcome Foundation. Majority of the funders are national funders from across the globe. And then there are some very specific funders with very specific agendas, such as, for example, the IDRC, which is the International Development Research Council, that funds primarily global health in low and middle income countries. So we are kind of a meta organization of funders. And Beverly, to answer your question about what would be appropriate in terms of, or what could be done in terms of technology, I'm going to limit my remarks to what the hat that I'm wearing today, which is of the funding organizations, to say as funding organizations, meta organizations such as GLOPADAR have existed for 4 or 5 years. Specific funders have specific agendas and specific mandates, but we have all coordinated to invest in what Carolyn was saying, the entire spectrum of the research and innovation agenda. So as funders, most of us, fund from everything from academic, basic science, preclinical research, all the way to the end of the pipeline in terms of clinical trials, phase 3 trials, etc. So this investment in funding has obviously played an important role in terms of the preparation for the current pandemic. These organizations have invested this and other organizations and consortium of funders such as UniFlu-Vac, which is led by CDC and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, are continuously considering and thinking what's needed in terms of research and innovation. So many of the platform technologies, vectors, etc., that are playing a really important role in the current pandemic have been ready to go because of these investments. Another really good example is the investments that were made from 2017 onwards in CEPI, because organizations such as CEPI, which focus primarily on pandemic preparedness platforms, has been ready to go. The investments in diagnostics, played a really important role in terms of having diagnostics that were ready to go within weeks. The enhanced investments in sequencing technologies, are playing a really important role even now as we deal with sort of the next phase of the pandemic with the emergence of the variants. So all of these investments, really are critical and continue to play a role in getting us prepared for the next phase of this pandemic, but also what may be emerging. Many of us were involved in discussions because, to the best of our guesses, we were guessing that it would be a next influenza pandemic that would come along, although coronaviruses with SARS and some of the other coronavirus outbreaks was a good candidate as well. So having experienced a coronavirus pandemic, we need to be aware that there could be a next pandemic that could be another influenza, another coronavirus. So in terms of what would be the technologies that would be best prepared to help us deal with it, I think we need to learn lessons from what we've learned so far. And as Caroline indicated, there's a lot of appetite currently within the governments and coordination to increase investments in pandemic preparedness funding. So I think that's definitely something that we need to look at closely. I have a lot of discussions with multiple agencies, organizations of places where we could have done better or we can do better in future. And among those things is that while we did do a lot of good communication and coordination in the sense of keeping each other informed where the investments are going, in terms of the real coordination for investing efficiently, I think that's definitely an area where there's an improvement needed. Putting together a global network similar to the influenza network, which actually played a really important role in activating international networks to get up and running and contribute to the current pandemic. I think investments such as those will be really, really important in terms of moving forward. So technologies are important. Technologies are areas where researchers are very aware of what's the next cutting edge technology. The mRNA technology that's playing such an important role in the current success of the vaccines, was being looked at and investigated and tried out for more than 20 years. It wasn't until the nanoparticle technology was optimized that the combination of the two really made it possible for a feasible vaccine to be formulated. So, the responsibility of the funders continues to be investing in the whole pipeline, starting from basic investments all the way to the end of the pipeline where the manufacturers can take over. Public-private partnerships are really, really important. They've clearly played an important role in terms of getting the vaccines or the therapeutics, or the diagnostics into the end of the pipeline. But I also want to, just for a minute, move away from the technologies per se to talk about excellence of research and development and innovation. And I'd like to emphasize 2 points here, that making sure that there's equity and diversity in the research environment plays a key role in making sure that we're doing the best of research and we're bringing all different ideas to the table. So as global investors in R&D, the funding agencies and the funding organizations are very invested in ensuring that there are different voices, different backgrounds, diversity of opinions that are coming to the table so we can make those investments in a diverse portfolio so that we can ensure that the technologies that develop are not limited to the ideas of a few, but to the ideas and differing options that come on the table from many. So I'll stop there for now and happy to continue the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Charu. Maria, would you like to give your comments, please?
Yes, absolutely. Good morning, afternoon, evening. It's a pleasure to be with you, Beverly and Carolyn and Charu. So I'll bring you the perspective of an academic-based product development partnership. We are the Texas Children's Hospital Center for Vaccine Development that I co-lead with Dr. Peter Hotes. And for the last 20 years, we have created an infrastructure to indeed bring from the discovery stage and fashion vaccine products and prototypes and transition them all the way to entering, of course, clinical trials. Our mission within the center has been primarily focusing on the so-called neglected tropical diseases, emerging infectious diseases, including, of course, coronaviruses. And we predicate on a three lines of mission statements. Being academic, as you know, we are here to advance research and development, and we create this through a few guiding principles, which are a little bit unique within the academic space in itself, even though now more and more academics are entering into the thought process of focusing on doing integrated product development, which also is very aligned to ensure that it's regulatory enabling, right? So not anymore just doing the research solely, of course, to advance, the scientific knowledge and, of course, publication and whatnot, but at the same time ensure that it's fashioned into a way where the data, the records, the documentation is enabler, right, to transition into a real product. The second is also ensuring that we train, right? So we do a lot of building capacity and education, which is very interesting because, as you know, sometimes it's quite difficult to get access to work in a pharmaceutical setting or a biotechnology setting. Being an academic-based vaccine center, we still have that flow, of course, of physician scientists, students, graduate level students, but at the same time also forging the building and strengthening of the capacity also with international trainees, for example. And that leads to another one of our guiding principles, which is, of course, being a product development partnership, is the collaboration where we have, not only local, national, but international collaboration that spearheads this ability of transitioning, again, this pipeline of products. Of course, we are also very attuned to that all of this work requires a very diversified portfolio of funding and a very sustainable ability of receiving and garnering this funding. So I appreciate very much the comments of the other panelists in ensuring continuity, sustainability, but also understanding that there's different funders for the different stages during a ecosystem of development, right? So it's not the same, the very early on basic research, the translational research, and then when you transition, of course, into the critical path activities, you, of course, require different type of funding agencies to contribute. And ultimately, of course, putting together all of this, you still require that you do your activities with the end in mind. And the end in mind also includes demand forecasting, communications, ensuring that there's going to be acceptance and that the product eventually is going to be used. So we, as you see, our product development partnership really has a very holistic approach where we do advocacy, we do communications engagement, science engagement. We then, of course, ensure that we address critical path activities. And ultimately, we also attend to the missions of, an academic health center. And, to give you an example, for coronaviruses, we started with an NIH-led fund that was given to us in 2011. We created this partnership approach, consortium of partners that brought, different multidisciplinary expertise from, of course, virologists that understood the pathogen, the virus. We, in our laboratories, produce the actual prototypes of the vaccine product. We, of course, use conventional platforms because we want suitability for low middle income countries. So we primarily focus on subunit type of vaccines. But to answer now your question about promising technologies, I would then now expand that it's been quite successful for us to use the conventional pathway of protein-based vaccines, but we now recognize that we really had to bring in alternative technologies or innovative technologies. So indeed, for many of our programs, we are now evaluating the RNA platforms as an example, right? And combine them and maybe even look, at, is there a role of still for example, priming with an RNA technology and then boosting with a conventional technology. And it depends on whether, of course, it's a cost or it's an accessibility, or of course also access to the manufacturing tech transfer partnerships. The other area that I think maybe we can discuss a little bit in the discussion point is beyond the actual platform to produce the candidate vaccines. We also work a lot with what we call formulation science, and here adjuvant technologies for us are very key and important. And we know that we are seeing now more innovation also in that respect. And combining the platform of the vaccine production, the formulation science, combined also, of course, with affordability, scalability, and accessibility. I think one of the last areas that we have been very interested is expanding that access of the partnership for doing the technology transfer. And this, of course, for us in the space of neglected diseases and certainly emerging infections, the developing country vaccine manufacturing network has been key. A lot more open capacity for us to enter into collaborative partnerships, which tend to be a little bit easier than maybe the multinational connections. Probably because, of course, of the fact that DCVMNs are also quite interested in the low middle income country setting. So I think we have had some really good experiences with India. So as an example, again, with coronavirus, we ended up, preparing a prototype seed bank and process, which we recently transferred to Biological E. And now maybe you're hearing that Biological E is advancing on RBD-based alum CpG Dynavax formulation, which is also now entering into phase 3 clinical trials. But we're open to many technology, right? Similar to Carolyn, we have, for example, one of our hookworm vaccines uses a tobacco plant expression system. We use, of course, yeast expression systems, insect cell expression systems, bacterial expression systems. If we need mammalian, we're now partnering with evaluating RNA technologies. And then we put together, again, delivery systems that involve formulation science. And we're also interested in different routes and different types of schedules, right? Not just the intramuscular, but also looking at, innovative routes of delivery. So I think I'm going to stop there. And I hope that we can have a very interesting discussion about how we can put all of these together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria. I mean, there's some really important points raised there. Lots of talk about the importance of partnerships, not only the public-private partnerships, but partnerships between groups. Also the importance of looking at how technologies can be used together. There was the example of, the mRNA move forward because the nanoparticle technology moved forward. That was something that Charu mentioned. Maria, you mentioned the adjuvant technology, which is very important for the formulation stage. And talking about regulatory enabled, so starting at the beginning of a project, knowing with the end in mind, so that you're actually building the first basis, I suppose, of a product right from the beginning. I just wondered if, so the environment and the conditions for R&D, there are obviously some success stories, but what else is missing? In what areas do you think we could improve on that? I'll go to Charu first and then Carolyn.
Yeah, so thanks, Beverly. That's a really, really important question, because as we move forward, not only do we need to celebrate the successes, which it really is. I just got my vaccine on Saturday, and I was sitting in the car and thinking that, a year ago, I was giving interviews to media and discussing and saying it could happen that we could have a vaccine in a year, but I'm not really sure. I think that was our sort of combined, everybody who's been in the vaccine area, and I'm an immunologist by training. I thought there was an outside chance that we could be lucky enough to get a vaccine, and here we are. A year later, there's more than 1.5 billion people who already have received the vaccine and very successful in terms of decreasing the caseloads. So while we celebrate the successes, I think there's lots of room for us to think through to see what we could have done better, how can we prepare better. So in that context, the preparation for a pandemic preparedness network, a global network, which the G7, G20 I talk about, it just came up, recently last week in the discussions that happened. Those are really, really important in terms of global coordination. Because even now we know that while 1.5 billion people have received the vaccine, there's more than 5.5 billion people that have not. And in the context of a pandemic, there's no out from the pandemic for anybody until there is equity in terms of the distribution of the vaccine. So I think Maria brought up some really key points about making sure that the development of technology, the infrastructure and capacity is distributed not only to the global north, but also to the global south and LMICs. So for GLOPIDAR, that is emerging as a key priority because we know that until and unless we have a large network of capabilities developed within the global south, we will continue to have some form of this pandemic. And, the best guesses are that this coronavirus will become like other seasonal coronavirus and settle into some kind of pattern where we see annual infection rates that will, submerge with the vaccines. So I think the idea that we need to develop really strong infrastructure and capacity for technologies, for vaccine manufacturing, for clinical trials, not only in the global north where majority of the funding, so as GLOPIDAR, we track where the investments in funding have gone, and of the $4.5 million that have been invested in more than 10,000 research projects, majority have gone to the developed countries. There's less than 1,000 of those projects that have really gone to the global south, invested. And if you look at, for example, how many projects went to Africa, there's probably about 350 research projects that were funded in Africa, as opposed to, for example, North America, more than 6,000 projects, were funded there. So it just shows the inequity, and that inequity is going to play out not just in terms of inequity of access for vaccines, but that inequity plays also a role in none of us being able to move forward from this pandemic, because the variants will keep emerging and we will have to deal with it, in an international scale. So that's a major issue in terms of the coordination and the investments that are needed. Some of the other things that I want to talk about is in terms of where we need to go with this is One Health is emerging as a really key priority across the globe for funders and for others, because we know that most of the new pandemics come out from an interaction between the environment, and climate change is a major issue, which is allowing new emergence of new organisms, and moving, the changing patterns of climate are allowing the pathogens to survive in new kind of environments. And then, of course, the zoonosis of transmission from intermediate hosts that are usually animals, whether it's influenza and birds or it's coronaviruses and bats, that's a really key area. So human health really needs to be connected to the environment and animal health. And that's an area where there has not been enough investment. Even now, when we look at the WHO R&D blueprint in terms of where investments have gone, that is not an area of strength. Vaccines, there have been more than $2 billion, even from the funders. But the One Health aspect remains underfunded and under examined. So those are two examples of coordination, focus on global South, and then some of the major issues such as One Health, which are becoming very important in the context of climate change, are areas that we can do better and that we need to focus on. And I'll stop there for now.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm so glad that you mentioned One Health. That did come up in a previous panel and is particularly a problem for diseases that don't actually cause a problem in the animal population, but if they transfer to humans, they do, and the importance of looking in that area. Carolyn, do you have any comments on how things could be improved?
Thank you, Beverly. And thanks, Charu. I think those are excellent points. And I'll speak from the manufacturer standpoint, the vaccine manufacturer standpoint. I think some of the areas to share to promote innovation would be, really an unhindered access to the pathogens and samples to support the development of new vaccines and treatments. I think, as I mentioned earlier, but it's important to have multiple validated manufacturing platforms so that we can get up and running quite quickly once the sequence has been identified. Coordinated networks of both domestic and global manufacturing. We've seen also evidence where countries have suffered, as Charu mentioned, where they don't have domestic capability. So I think it's important that we look a little bit more avidly at trying to enhance domestic capability. Avoid raw material supply shortage. This has been an issue for a lot of vaccine manufacturers. And how can we improve that, whether it be a better coordination or perhaps some, again, federal funding potentially for raw materials. Urge governments coordinate with the WTO to eliminate trade and regulatory barriers to adopt and practices for export that could facilitate and expedite cross-border supply, especially for manufacturing materials, and also potentially for prioritizing skilled manufacturing workforce. And then I think a strong collaboration between regulatory authorities. Again, I think there's been good examples in this recent pandemic of that, but certainly more could be done. We've learned quite a bit that where it took normally 4 to 8 years to develop a vaccine, as Charu mentioned, we've been able to do it in about a year. That's really been because of good coordination with regulatory authorities, but also the authorities willing to allow for a lot of development aspects in parallel instead of sequential. And I think that's been very important. And I think also potentially collaborating on things like inspection of facility, more could be potentially done there as well. And again, we had to be, and the authorities had to be very innovative during this pandemic because of restriction in travel. So some of those points, I think from a manufacturing standpoint, I think are important to really ensure that we have a fast response to whatever the next new virus is. I'll stop there, Beverly.
Okay, thank you, Carolyn. I certainly agree that the unhindered access to pathogens is absolutely critical. I mean, it would be, we'd be in a very different situation if the genetic sequence data from the coronavirus had not been shared so rapidly and continued to be shared so that we were aware of the different variants that are emerging. So some really good points there. Thank you. Maria, do you have anything from your perspective on what could be improved?
Sure. So again, looking at the continuity and understanding that at some level, the real success that we have seen with the speediness of developing vaccines for COVID-19 really come from the fact that we had years of prior experience, right? And years of prior support to study coronaviruses, including, of course, the One Health approach. But that support is definitely fragmented, right? So, for example, we know that in our vaccine center, we started working on a prototype SARS vaccine back in 2011. We received, very generous funding. We met all our milestones, but when we were looking for the next steps after we achieved those milestones, the priority of SARS was not there anymore, which is fine, right? I mean, good again, but there was a disruption of that continuity of what we call this warm-based funding, right? Of maintaining and keeping, evaluating these products, because it could have potentially even enabled, even a much accelerated access to data and information with regards to potential other coronavirus vaccines, right? So we started with, SARS, of course, then you transition into a MERS, and then all of a sudden those were not priority. And so there was a non-continuity of the support, right? And support scientifically, financially, and of course, unless you had, for example, your own intramural funds, we couldn't potentially have continued our coronavirus initiative within our vaccine center, right? And now we know that, that is probably something that, we can improve. We've seen that the power of having the funders really nicely aligned, all funding in different areas of the ecosystem of development, it's important, but to have the continuity of that ecosystem in the future, I think that will be very important. And I think that adding to the challenges of how we can improve indeed in the areas of manufacturing, I think that brings back to the same question. The earlier you do this, start thinking of the technology transfer and with whom you're doing your technology transfer with, it's essential, right? And we know that, we can have a lot of enabling in the area of having access to supplies or having access of, certainly the framework of how you do that scale up in the production. But you really need to start identifying who are your partners in that technology transfer, because technology transfer is not easy, right? Especially if you bring these novel technologies. So I think, again, it's the sustainability, I think, it's what we really need to improve. We know we can do it efficiently when we have enough money and when we have an urgency, but going again to look at, pandemic flu or just seasonal flu, what has been the good thing in the influenza field, right? At some level, it's the continuity, right? That maybe some of these other emerging infections have not really gotten, and ideally, we want to then expand that sustainability and continuity in all scientific, financial, and certainly operationally too, and implementation-wise.
Yeah, so really the importance of, you can't be doing all the development in the time of a pandemic. So, the funding in what is often referred to in peacetime is really, really critical to keep that momentum going and taking it to a stage that gives us a good starting point in response to a pandemic. I know some people say in influenza, the good thing is we get to practice every year, which builds that sustainability in for a pandemic response. Thank you very much for those. The next question is, what investments, either technical or human, do you think we need to be making now to enable the next futuristic product like an mRNA to be created and developed quickly? This time I'll go to Carolyn first.
Thank you, Beverly. I think you brought up a very good point. In order to be ready again, I think Maria made an excellent point. You can't have the pandemic preparedness research done in the year of a pandemic. It has to be done ahead of time. And in order to have the scaled capability to manufacture, you need to have that in place. And of course, you can't have that just sitting idle. I think in the case of influenza, which we are also developing vaccines in that space for seasonal influenza, it gives us the ability to have a platform quite easily that was already validated for flu that we could easily adopt for the COVID vaccine. So it is important to tap into expertise that exists, and I think influenza is a great example of that. I think some of the other aspects that Maria brought up is also important. The pandemic preparedness funding, and Beverly, you mentioned it as well, having government funding for the research and the technology development that needs to go on year after year, so that you're ready when you do need to, produce for a pandemic, is very important. And I think, I know we as a small company have often fought to get some of that funding so that we could be ready for any potential pathogen. And I think the more that we can look at that for sustainability, that came up a number of times. That's really what it's about, is having the funding so companies can engage, in addition to the academics, engage in developing the technology, being ready, so that when that pathogen emerges, we've got not only a validated platform, but we've had the precursors, if you will, of the work done in the R&D to be able to get up and running quickly. And that was the example that came out of the mRNA with the SARS-1 and MERS. Thanks, Beverly.
Okay, thank you. Maria?
I think that we can have very good workforce. We can certainly also have, the factories, the infrastructure, the technology, but you really need to have the quality management system prepared and ready. And of course, also the regulatory framework, especially in countries that are still striving to reach the level 4 or at least a high level of of stringency, right? So we can certainly speak about the research, the development, preparing tech transfer, but we really have to remember that all of this really happens surrounded by the need of a strong quality management system, and that the agencies that eventually are going to be able to review and audit and approve are also trained and qualified. And I think that that's also what makes this sustainability and continuity complex, because there's also a very patchy world in respect to the support that us in the R&D, manufacturers, or even in a given country, you get in order for you to always have a very strong framework of quality and regulatory. And I think that funders, I have to say, that's one of the things that we struggle a lot in our vaccine center. I mean, you can get a nice grant to do the hypothesis driven work or the scientific technical work, but when you start asking, can you help me pay for the regulatory, my project management, my risk assessment people, my business development, whatever, the quality, the stability, there is like, no, that our funding source doesn't really fund that. I mean, we fund just the bench lab experiment, but not necessarily all the operational activity. So I think that is something that we should also strive to include, that it should be, again, a holistic, funders should look at this holistically. And then one aspect that maybe we haven't spoken to is not only in the technical aspects, but also, of course, the clinical aspects. We have to make sure that we have strong clinical trial networks together with strong manufacturing technology networks, and they should also speak to each other, of course. Thank you. Back to you.
Thank you. Charu, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, so I think I'll take off where Maria left off, because Some of the successes in the current pandemic have been because of, so UK has sort of set the bar for what it means to do rapid clinical trials in terms of applying the basic technology and platform technology to delivering the results. They've been able to do that both in the space of therapeutics, to identify what works, but also importantly, what doesn't work through their trials, the recovery trials, and also in the space of vaccines. And some of the, from an investment in R&D point of view, from funders' point of view, there has been a lot of investments that have not borne or come to fruition because of the fragmented networks and fragmented clinical trials that have taken place. So the coordination with WHO, which Glopidar does, routinely. The moving forward part is a lot of what Maria was alluding to, that this idea of having large multinational platform trial networks that are ready to be pivoted. And it doesn't fit into the technical or human, but it is both. In terms of what's needed, because the basic researchers and preclinical studies can tell you what are the promising vaccines. But one of the successes, as Carolyn alluded to, has been the parallel ability to run phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3, more or less overlapping, which has really sort of borne the benefits of having a vaccine within a year. And some of it is at-risk investments on the part of the government and the ability of regulatory agencies to be open to those ideas, which has set a really good precedence for that being allowed in times of emergency. But areas for improvement would be, for example, this formation of a large international clinical trials network, which is really sort of based on developing common protocols that can be adapted to the local needs and testing products that they could add on. So really a platform trial. So that, I think that's really important in terms of what we could do in future to be more ready, because that, I call it, we built that plane as we were flying. That was never done before. We kind of got into that and kind of developed that. And it has really borne a good outcome. So I think that's something that in peace times, we can think about and do better. And that's definitely a focus for the funders to see how can we do that better, because it is a more efficient use of funding investments. It also allows us to invest funding and get clinical trials running in places where the pandemic is. So we've seen in the last 14 months that there are waves of where the pandemic is, sort of raging, compared to some places where things were brought under control early, and now, there's much more case numbers there. So clinical trials need to be coordinated to where work can actually be done, and large multinational platform trials allow for that. So that's definitely an area that we need to focus on. The other thing that I'll quickly mention in terms of human and technical investments is that we've seen the role play out for non-medical interventions in the current pandemic, that while we are building the technologies and the vaccines and the therapeutics, the non-medical interventions have really played a key role in controlling the pandemic and keeping under control. And there's need for innovation there as well, in understanding better the infection prevention and control measures, which are still sort of, what would have been used 100 years ago. And we've had a lot of confusion between mask, no mask, double mask, distance, how much distance, aerosol transmission, not transmission. So I think there needs to be more thinking that goes into that space. And then finally, the role of social sciences. We've seen that play out in real time, how important it is. And we will see that, in the next 6 months, that a vaccine is only as good as its uptake. So we can have as best vaccines as are available until we build vaccine confidence, in populations around the world. We won't reach a level of protection that really addresses this pandemic. So I think looking at the social sciences and understanding that will be really, really key in terms of making sure that we can be prepared for the future.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I think your collective answers to that last question just show just how complex the picture is. It's not enough just to fund the innovative R&D, but you have to be able to transition that into a manufacturing process. You have to have the quality and regulatory support. You've got to think about tech transfers, and then you've got all the other things, skilled workforce, the clinical trial network, and how that all interplays. So it's very complex, but so important. You all talked about coordination as well, and making sure that different groups are aware of different activities. So I want to thank you so much for your inputs today. We're almost out of time. I'm so sorry we didn't have longer to discuss this, because I think we could have gone on for at least another hour. So I'd like to thank our panelists today. So Carolyn, Charu and Maria, for your excellent points made. And I will move on to the next panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Beverly.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Okay.
A pleasure.